Okay, in this video tutorial we're going to look at creating a crate. This is quite a simple object, but it's going to look at a number of different the different modelling tools that we've been looking at over the past week or so. So just in this example we have our starting blocks and then just building through to different levels of complexity on this, and ultimately what we'll come out with, not at the end of this tutorial but over the next couple of weeks, is creating a low poly and a high poly object and then baking the normals down from the high poly to the low poly. So notice on this one I have my info up, so we can go to display to the heads up display and just show our poly count. And then here if I click on this object we can see this is 156 tries. This is 13,964. But this still has all the detail on it that this one does. Okay. If we just look at the wireframe and shaded, again we can kind of see the amount of detail on this compared to this, but this one still has some of the detail in there, including kind of rounded corners and the planks in there as well, and even the indentation. Not the indentation, the embossing of the nails as well. Okay, so I'm going to do a new scene, and what I'm also going to talk through this is actually customizing the workspace a little bit in terms of the toolbars. So the first thing I'm going to do on my workspace is go to the modeling standard. I do want on here my channel box as well, so I'm just going to press Ctrl A. My channel box up, I'm going to drag this over and dock this just by dragging it over. So I have my channel box, my modelling toolkit and my attribute editor there as well. Okay. And I'm going to make my own custom shelf as well. So I'm just going to go over to the shelves, over to the settings menu and do a new shelf, and let's call this modelling tools. We don't want to use spaces in these names. We'll come up with an error, and then we can start adding the tools to this. Okay, so I'll add those as we go through. So the first one, actually, we're going to start with a cube. So I'm going to go into Create, Polygon Primitives, and to actually add this to the shelf, all we need to do is press Ctrl and Shift, and then just left click, and that's going to add that to our shelf. And that's the same with all the tools. Anything we want to add, we just Ctrl Shift, left click. So let's click on this. Let's go into its settings. So in the channel box, just go into the polycube, and I'm going to set this to be a 1/2 meter packing crate. So 50 by 50 by 50. Remembering this is in centimeters. Press F to just focus in on this, and that is now our starting point. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude this. So I'm just going to go into face mode by right clicking, select all the faces, and I'm going to do a Ctrl E. So going to open up our poly extrude face. Now what I want to do is create an offset for each of these individual polygons. If I try to do this as it is right now, it's not going to let me do that. What we need to do on this is we need to use this keep faces together. So to click on this and click that to be off and then do an offset, then that allows us to actually create an offset for each individual face. I'll set this to around 6 and just do that, that's fine. And then what we can do is we can use the G shortcut key. So if I press G on the keyboard, we can use that, so basically it repeats the last tool. So now we have our poly extrude back, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just decrease the thickness on this. About 1.2. Okay, so I have something like that. I'm going to go into shading and just put my wireframe on shaded on, and then I'm going to start tweaking this. So I could leave this at this point, that would be fine for a low poly one, But what I'm going to do is actually go a bit further just to show a few of the different tools in this. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make this corner so that we have another box on this. If we wanted to ever extrude this corner and make some kind of cap on there, or create a seam along here, a few different things we may want to do, would need the geometry or the topology developed in a different kind of way. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the extrude tool on in the in our shelf. So under our edit mesh down here we have the extrude tool. So again, let's Control Shift click to add that to our shelf before we do anything. And then the next tool I'm going to use, I'm going to go into my modeling toolkit. I'm going to use the multi-cut tool. I'm going to click on this. So what we can do with this is we can go from, there's a couple of ways we can use this tool, but with this one I'm going to create cuts from vertex point to vertex point. So the angle that we have the viewport on is very important on this. So I'm just going to click on this point here. So we're clicking on these outer points. Click once, left click, then just not dragging or anything, I just need to go across to this point and click. Now if I have this too far around, we get a different icon. It's basically saying that we can't do this. Essentially it can't see where it's doing the cut, so it needs to be able to see what it's doing. So we just have the where we need to cut through facing on. So click on this side, and that's created our cut, and I can press enter on that. It's worth noting that depending where we have our viewport is sort of the angle that's going to create the cut. So if I have this at this angle, so I'll do another one in this corner here. So again, left click once, left click again, press enter. You can see it's sort of done it how this viewport is facing this. If I turn this round a little bit, so I just undid that, do that again, we do get a bit of a straighter line on there. So again, just press enter. If we don't press enter, by the way, it's going to carry on doing the next cut from where we left off from the previous cut. So again, just looking at this one, go from this point to this point and press enter. There we have that. Okay. At this point, it's a good idea to either click on the select and move or just a select tool. Q for just to select, or W for select and move, just so we're not doing anything else with that tool. The multi-cut tool is a great tool, but if you forget that it's on, you may accidentally carry on cutting through or adding extra vertices points where you don't want them. Just as a word of warning. Okay. So here you can see we've just got this these extra cuts now. Got this extra bit of geometry on here. So to make this a little easier to see, I'm going to grab these three edges, just shift selecting those, and I'm just going to press backspace on those just to get rid of them, so we can kind of see what we're doing. So the cuts are in the right place, but I can just see that some of these, just because of the way we've used the multi-cut and the angle we've had this at, they're not completely flush with the lines that go through. Okay, a bit wonky on there. So I'm going to straighten that up. So again, just use another tool. So I'm going to right click, vertex. I'm going to select, say, this vertex point here. And what I'm going to use is the snaps. So we've got a couple of snap options up here. So we've got, go over these. What's up? Snap to grids, snap to curves, snap to points, snap to projector center, and snap to view planes, and then just making objects live. So I'm going to use a couple of these during the course of this tutorial. And the first one I'm going to use is this snap to points, which essentially allows us to snap to these vertex points. Now we can either click on the snap here, which activates the snap, and that means that's active until we switch back on this tool. So this is like a toggle on there. The way that I prefer to do this is with a shortcut. So we can press the V key down. Now if I press the V key down, so we use a middle mouse drag on this. If I just do this, it's going to just kind of drag this around until we can snap to a point, which is, I don't really want that. What I want to do is I want to limit this snap to certain axes on here. So I don't want to, I know this vertical one's pretty much okay. It's in the right place. So I just want to snap certain axes. So for example, on this one I can see that this x-axis, this vertex point on the x-axis isn't right. So I want to just snap that. So I'm going to press V, hold that down, middle mouse drag over just the x-axis, and just drag down to the point that I want to snap to. Okay. Just going to do the same just with this z-axis. Just go to that point, and the y should be okay. Let's just do that anyway. Okay, so we just snap those points in. Going to do the same with this one. So again, with this one, z-axis, snap to this one. The x-axis up to there, and then again the y-axis should be okay. Okay, and our last one is this one here. So again, V, middle mouse, and the others should be right, but I'm going to check them anyway. Okay, so just snapping to points. So it's a great way of lining things up. The snap tool is a brilliant tool, and just with V on, you can see that it's actually toggling on there as well as I'm just pressing V down. Is a quick way to use that. So just click on the move tool. So again, what I'm going to do is add that multi-cut tool to my toolbar or my shelf. So it's under mesh tools. Control Shift click on the multi-cut. We have that in there as well. Okay. So the next step to this is well, I could go around each of these individual corners now and do exactly the same thing. But again, just to show another technique that we can use to do this kind of work. If we spent a lot of time on one part of a model and then we want to duplicate that work, what we can do is we can actually start cloning areas of this model. So first thing I need to do is create a central point. What I'm going to do is kind of isolate this corner and then duplicate that and make copies of it and flip those around. So we've got this corner on each of the four corners of our cube. So for this I'm going to use the mesh tool. I'm going to use insert edge loop. And just to show you another way to get to some of these tools, well, I've got my object selected. If I just shift right click, then we've got this tool here, insert edge loop tool. I'm actually going to go to the settings of this, and if you wanted to, again, you could dock this in over here just to get out of the way, but I'll probably end up getting rid of that just to give myself more space to model. So I'm going to use, let's just reset this tool. So relative distance from edge is the standard one, which just allows us to drag out a edge loop. But what I'm going to use is, because I want one perfectly in the center, I'm going to use a multiple edge loop, and I'm going to set this to 1. So this is going to create one loop right in the center of the edge that I select. So I'm going to click on just one of these edges through this ring. I'm not worrying about this for a second. Click one here, and then one on this side, and then we've got an area that becomes our corner. So again, to fix these, I can just use a snap tool. It's just V, middle mouse drag, just snap on the correct axes. So V, middle mouse drag, and that's fixed that really quickly. Okay, so now we have this corner. Just going to drag this off. I'm just going to close this to give myself some room. And now going into face mode, I'm going to delete all the faces but these ones here. These are essentially the ones I want to keep. So I'm just going to do this bit by bit. Press delete. What I would always do here, I just did that one without checking, is just have a quick look around, make sure that I've not selected any of the faces I want to keep. There we go. And there we're left with just our corner that we've worked on. And what we could actually do with this is carry on detailing this if we wanted to, if we're adding any more detail to it before we start copying this over. But for me, this is kind of all I want to do at the minute. So, grab this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this by doing a Control D, duplicate. I'm going to go into my channel box. And the way we can actually flip this round, so I want to make a copy of this, but basically I've made the copy already, just to show you. Just undo that. I want to flip this on the x-axis. So we can see down here we're on our x-axis over here. So what we can do is we can go over to the channel box, and in the scale X, I can set this to -1, and that's going to flip that. Okay, and the way it's doing this is actually mirroring it or flipping it around this its pivot point, which currently is perfectly in the center of this object. Okay, I can now take these two objects, and what we can do with them is we can combine them. We can do that either through the modeling toolkit. We have the combine. We can do this through mesh menu and combine, or we can do this by shift right clicking, and again down here we have combine. Okay, so that's now one object. So we want to do the same. Want to flip this, but we have a problem with this. If I just do this first of all, and then I will undo it. So Control D, and let's say that we were flipping this now on the Z-axis. This is to -1. You can see it's not. Well, it has done it around its pivot point, which I'll talk about in a second. But you can see it's not done it at what we wanted to do. I'd have to drag this out and move it to the right position, which we don't really want to have to do that. So let's delete that. So the problem has happened when we've actually combined these two. So by combining objects, before the pivot point was down here at the origin, which is because when we made the model in the first place, it created that at the origin with its center point at 0, 0, 0, and that's where the pivot remained. Even when we deleted faces, the pivot was still at this point, which is a great thing to do when you're modeling, to have the center of the object at that origin. But when we combined them, the pivot point was moved, so it averaged out into the center of this new object. So you can see it is in the center of that. It's just not where we want it. So the way we can do this is we can actually move the pivot point and reposition this. There's two ways to activate the pivot point, because right now we're in object mode, so we're just selecting the object itself. If I just press Insert on the keyboard, that actually changes this gizmo, so now we're controlling just the pivot point there. Okay, and I can press Insert again, and that toggles back to the object. So again, another way to do this is with the D key. So if I press the D key, again that is just a toggle. So switch that on, off, on, off. That is allowing us to access our pivot point. Okay. So we could do the same kind of thing as we did with the vertices we were snapping, because essentially I want to put this into the center. So I could use these 2 points here, which is central to the object, to use as a basis for the center of this pivot point as well. So if I press D down and keep that held down, and then press V down as well, I could middle mouse drag over the Z-axis and move that to there, and then over the Y-axis and move that to there, and let's put that back to where we want that again. Okay. Show you another way to do that as well, working on the fact that we've got this, and you can see this is actually set it back at the origin, which is where it was. So let's look at another way that we can do that as well. So what I can do with this pivot point is go to Modify, Center Pivot, and that puts it back at the center of our object. So instead of snapping to the points, what I can also do is snap to the grid. So we have this snap setting up here, snap to grid, and again we have a keyboard shortcut for this, which is X. So what I'm going to do, press D down, keep it held down, press X, and this time I can just drag from the middle of this and just move that into position. I'm just going to zoom in on this, D and X, and just snap that to the origin. Okay, and that's perfectly in the center for us. So now I'm going to duplicate this again, Control D, and I'm going to flip this on the Z-axis. I actually set it. There we go. And this time it's worked. Okay. So now I'm just going to flip these two. I'm not going to combine them, because if I combine them, I'm going to have the same problem. I'm going to have to move the pivot point again. It's going to go up here into the center again. So I just need to move it down. So instead of doing that, I'm actually just going to take these two individually. Control D, and I'm going to flip them on the Y-axis. So set this one to -1 on the Y, And let's grab this one, Control D, and let's flip this on the Y as well. And now what I can do with all these sections is just select them all. I have all 4 of them, and I can combine these. So let's just shift right click, combine, and there we have our object. Okay. So one final thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to get out. We don't really want these middle points now. They're just taking up unnecessary geometry, making the polygon count higher without any reason. They're not affecting the silhouette of this object in any way. But first, what I want to do is I need to do some welding. Just to show you this, if I go into one of these vertices points and just rather than drag select around it, I'm just going to click on it, just to select one and drag that out of the way, and you can see actually this model isn't connected together. We combined them, but we didn't weld all these points, so it's one cohesive set of vertex points. So the way we can do that, just in vertex mode, I'm just going to select all of the vertex points, all the vertices. And if I go to Edit Mesh, we have these 2 options here. We have Merge and Merge to Center. Now, if I was just to select these bit by bit, so if I just drag select around these 2, and you can see when I move these, they move together because I've actually selected both those vertices points rather than just clicking on one and being able to move those apart. We can use the Merge to Center, and what that will do is average out the distance between the 2 points and weld them into the center of those areas. So if I do that, it won't seem to do anything, but if I then click, you can see that's worked. We can do that on other vertices as well. So if I was to take, just as an example, these 2, and let's just press G to repeat the last command, you can see it actually averages out the distance between those 2 and welds them in the center of the 2 vertex points. So let's Control Z that to undo it. So if I was to select all of these and do that, so again I'll just press G, what we do is basically we weld all the vertex points down to one central point, which obviously we do not want for this. So instead we can use just the Merge option. And what the Merge option does is give us a distance threshold. Now because we had the pivot point in the right place for this, when we were flipping these around before we're combining them, all the vertex points should be over each other, so it should be perfect. So essentially we don't need this distance threshold to be very large. We don't really want it to be anything, so it's default 0, 0, 1, which should be absolutely fine. Okay. And if I just click on any of these points now, so let's just do another one. See, they should all be welded. Okay. If you have vertices points that you need to weld together, so again, just an example, if I just select, say, if I just select, say, this one and this one, and I wanted to weld those 2 points, and I didn't want to use a Merge to Center, I can use Merge, and it's the size of the threshold that matters, really. So the smaller the threshold, it just kind of decides how close together those 2 are. So you just got to be careful about that. But if you want to get things that are just slightly apart from each other, increase the threshold, and that will weld them in. If you don't want things to weld together that are close together, then just decrease the threshold. Okay. So the final thing with this is just to get these edges. So I'm just going to double click on one and then shift double click on the others. Just make sure that we've got all those. This is a good sign if you're grabbing these edge loops by double clicking. Basically, if these go all the way around, it means you've had no problems with the welding. If these only go to a certain point, so say it went through but didn't grab that one, then you've probably got a problem with a vertex point there that you need welding or sorting out. So it's a good visual clue that everything's okay. And grab that. So to delete these, if I just do a backspace, what that's going to do is going to leave the vertex points, and we don't want that. So again, let's just undo that. So what we want to do with this, make sure I'm in edge mode, is just do a Control backspace, and what that will do is get rid of all the edges and the vertices as well. Okay. So that's our low poly crate. The final thing, what we want to do is we want to clean up a little bit. So right here we have all the things we've done on this. And these add up and eventually can cause problems and maybe corrupt files. So as a final thing, what I'm going to do, select my mesh, go to edit, delete by type, and delete my history. So Alt-Shift-D. Okay. And just as another thing as well, just because I forgot to do it, I'm going to add some more tools to my shelf. So let's look at the other ones that I used. So we use edit mesh, and we used we've got our multi-cut, we've got our extrude, we used our merge to center. So again, just shift, control, and clicking on these. We used our combine on there, and I can also put the history on there as well. So delete by type history, click on that one, and that's got our history as well. So we can access all these tools now up here, which is useful to be able to do. Okay, you can see now we've got a perfectly clean history as well. I'm going to finally name this. We've got this create 01, create, try that again, create underscore 01, and there we have it. So I can save that file out, and then we're ready to move on to the high poly model. And that's the end of that tutorial.